The child in me feels overwhelmed, betrayed, scared, hurt by the barriers, by the controls, by the threats, by the abuse contract, etc. The adolescent feels rebellious, hostile, angry, resentful at the hypocrisy, at the incompetence, at the abuse, the lies, the secrets, and obviously feels angry at an authority figure for behaving so hypocritically. The adult, however, and I'm talking about Jach Pursel, the adult feels curiosity, empathy, some understanding, some humor, dark and light, looking at what it's like to be Jach Pursel in this context. So Lazaris will tell Jach that Jach made these choices before his lifetime, and that Jach creates his own reality. But if Jach is like 95% of the rest of the Lazaris community, no one remembers these choices. Lazaris likes to talk in a way that blurs the boundary between this concept of self prior to birth and this concept of self here. I have zero memory of ever making a single choice before this lifetime. I have zero memory of anything between or before lifetimes. So it's a little bit of a stretch or an act of faith to be told, and some degree of martyrhood, meaning asked to carry burdens that are too heavy to carry, to actually ask this self to be responsible, to be able and willing to respond to something that it has no memory of. Now, Lazaris is quick to fill in those gaps. Well, you decided this for this reason and that reason and this and that and the other. Says who? Says a non-physical entity that you have no way of verifying. And so again, it's very much like giving an amnesiac pill to, telling someone to hide $100 in a safe, giving them a pill that wipes all prior memory, and then saying, well, you had that memory, go and find it. Why aren't you looking for it? Open the box, give me back the $100. It's a certain, there's a certain humor in that kind of absurdity, the same as if you type information into a computer, then erase the memory, and then say, go get the information. You have to differentiate between the self that is present in the body today with the memories available to that self and whatever happened before or after. And Lazaris does not do that well at all. He talks as if they're the same self, which is fine if that is Lazaris's perspective, if that's what Lazaris actually sees. But it's profoundly unhelpful for the person getting that information as if they're one self when there's this partition of memory and biology between these two selves. So that's one example of how non-physical channeling can actually be more frustrating, more irritating, less helpful than a human being that will relate within the bounds that one can see. There's lots of analogies that can be, put through to that. But anyway, here's Jach apparently agreeing to host a non-physical entity. Well, this has huge repercussions for his life. surprise, surprise, there is no manual. No one's come ahead of time and said, Jack, in the event that a non-physical entity or something that you don't have any connection to starts talking out of your mouth when you're asleep, here's what you do with it. And if they contravene and contradict, a large portion of the established norms of your cult, here's what you do about that. So there is no manual. So one could say that being a channel of Lazaris is a burden too heavy to bear for a cultured American mind. That's just, here we are, this is what we want to do, etc. How do you figure that out? Now, Barbara Brannon has talked about Jach's childhood abuse and shame. And there's nothing unusual about that in the United States. But the thing with shame and abuse and the trauma that comes with it is they dissociate the inner child in partitions, in templates of fight, flight, and freeze, and contracts of survival and contracts of abuse. The Lazaris material in no way assures the lifting of that abuse contract. And so, it is, a reality that a majority of grown-ups in our culture are not adults, meaning they're not operating free of these contracts. They're not aware of the distinctions between child, adolescent, and adult. And there is no initiation in our culture into adulthood. And what this effectively means is that the repressed, regressed, traumatized child and adolescent is dealing with a good chunk of our reality. Now, for some people more than others, for others, less so. For some, it's more in this area, in this area. But no one is free in our cult of remnants of this shame, abuse, etc. Which means that a child in some areas, an adolescent in other areas, has to figure out what's the spiritual thing to do with this. I remember the overwhelm I felt when my father died or was on his deathbed in one of these regressed places. I had just been sexually abused by my therapist, which leads to 60% of therapeutic patients statistically developing PTSD, if not more. A lot of crazy making, insanity. And not surprisingly, my therapist was a child, was an adolescent, angry at me for telling the truth. Not angry at himself for his stupidity and cruelty and behavior, angry at me for ruining his life. And this is how, grown-up children behave. They blame the other children because there's no adult there. And, so it's a regressed child trying to figure out, how do I respond responsibly like an adult when I don't feel like an adult? And, here's a seemingly big event in life, an abusive sociopathic father doing his best in an abusive and sociopathic cult, doing its best. It's not that there's one villain here. There are just dysfunctional mental and emotional and social diseases migrating unconsciously from one generation to the next. I mean, my grandfather developed PTSD with a tank shell in his knee, stuck in a tank in France in World War II, and he's just thrown back into my father's family and said, here, take care of this 6-year-old who feels abandoned by you, who doesn't know who you are, who feels shamed, and you've got a raging, violent, military veteran who is shamed for having needs, who's shamed for having feelings. Well, what do you expect? He traumatizes my father into the state of terror and loneliness. And, he doesn't grow up. My father doesn't grow up emotionally after about 6 years old. He's frightened. He's very smart. But he's relating to the world as a frightened child. He doesn't feel safe, and there's no one to talk to in that cult, in that generation. Well, this is Jach's generation. And so, here's Jach Pursel, a child in many ways, a cult brainwashed individual, in the chauvinism, in the racism that is the American cult in many ways. And here, you're going to channel this entity. It's a relatively new phenomena. I had never heard of channeling, at age 12. It was very odd to hear that it existed. Well, Jach has to listen to tapes of what he's saying, coming out of his mouth. Well, this cult doesn't care about Jach Pursel. This cult doesn't say, wow, you're having a new experience. Let's all brainstorm and help you make the best of this for humanity. No, this cult judges him, you're weird. This cult, looks at him as, are you a scam artist? This cult, looks at him, are you a parent figure? Are you a this figure? Jach doesn't know what to do with any of that stuff. Any more than you and I do. This cult doesn't prepare people to be channels, amongst many other things. And it doesn't prepare you to be a business owner. Thankfully, I left school at age 14 to study business from mentors who knew a lot about business. And so I had a good sense of, ethics and things like that, because I'd read dozens and dozens of intimate biographies, the founders of the Sony Corporation, the way Bill Gates abused people at Microsoft, the way Steve Jobs abused people at Apple, fear and shame and competition, the way Donald Trump, sets off, and endlessly sets up competitions that mirror his own childhood abuse family. So I'd read about a lot of this stuff. So I knew a little bit, but I wouldn't have from school. School doesn't prepare us for running a business, for being a good boss, for being a good parent. Pathetic as a cult protocol for raising an adult, raising a parent, raising a good boss. It's just up for grabs. However, what we're very good at in America is as soon as someone succeeds in some area or, has a lot of money is usually what that means, we then take pot shots. It's like, they're not doing that right. They're not doing that right. That's not very nice. Because they become an authority figure. But, do I as a boss, I've been a boss for 22 years, something like that. Do I like being feared? Do I like being, having this projected? Do I like the fact that if I lay someone off for the winter because there isn't enough work that, they may not be able to pay the rent? I don't like any of that. Nor have I, gotten any training in like, here's how this is done and here's how that's done and here's the most empathic. No, it's a very sociopathic culture. And the way you can tell the difference between a sociopathic culture and an empathic culture is that in an empathic culture, you go into the bank and when you need the most money, when you've got $200,000 of medical bills, when you can't work because you're taking care of your your dying husband, that's when the bank gives you money. When you need it, that's empathic. A reptilian or sociopathic culture only gives people money when they don't need it because we're not thinking about the person, we're thinking about the bank. So the bank is the strong one in the relationship. and it cares about itself, not its people. The politician is the strong one, writing the laws, having extra money, having all kinds of ability to do backroom deals. And so in an empathic culture, the politician asks, what's best for my constituents? In a sociopathic culture, the politician asks, what's best for me? And it's wonderful that Trump has done such a good job of illustrating the truth of our sociopathic nature, that most people are far more ashamed of, and so they hide it. You know, you can read about all the corruption in the Clintons and the Bidens and the Bushes. It doesn't matter which side. You know, the most bipartisan aspect of Washington is we all agree to enable corruption of this style and write the laws that allow us and our family members to get very rich lobbying. And we'll all cooperate on that. But we will not cooperate on what's best for the public. We will cooperate on what's best for us. That's the distinction between the reptilian and the empathic centers of the brain. We love to evict, like there's a whole wave of evictions going on during COVID right now. Well, the landlords are saying this is not good for me. Who gives a shit about homeless people that can't pay their rent? I want even more money for my investment properties. Get rid of these people. So when the strong prey on the weak, when the parent preys on the child, the levels of incest, enormous. The levels of sexual abuse, enormous in our cult. Because the big person, the giant, has to get their needs met at the expense of who? The small person. Jach Pursel has his staff sign NDAs. Does he sign an NDA for his staff? Does Jach Pursel sign a long abuse contract before someone agrees to work with him? No, it's a completely one-sided contract, just like the contract with the customer. You give up all of your rights, I give up nothing. You do all of you stay secret and silent, I talk about whatever I want. You work for below average wages, I'll work for above average wages. So we have, the exact same template of the strong preying upon, the weak. It's chauvinism, the masculine preying on the feminine, just expanded out in a large scale. But this is the model. This is what you do unless you wake up and figure it out on your own and decide to do differently. It's not as if Jach Pursel wrote the rules on domination, staff abuse, shaming, negligence, or anything like that, or the rules on hypocrisy or any other form of chauvinism. That's what you do if you're a normal American, because that's what the majority of Americans do in a position of power. Rely more on the reptilian brain, stimulated from early childhood trauma, than on the empathic brain. Now, you're in an empathic brain when the rich who have 5 empty bedrooms figure out which homeless person needs the most support and tries to help out. Plows profits not needed for themselves back into the community. Doesn't shut a factory just to save 5 cents on the dollar by shipping it overseas, or at the very least facilitates a transition. That's empathy. The sociopathic thing is the shareholder who by definition is wealthier than the employees, because you've got investment money, will trash a town in order to get even more money. So Jach's born into a reptilian culture and defaults to a reptilian culture, and Lazaris goes right along with it. It's not like you've ever heard Lazaris explaining these distinctions or applying them to concept synergy or pointing out any of the fraudulent or traumatic aspects. No, Lazaris doesn't go into that. So Jach's on his own. amidst norms that are unhealthy. But he's publishing material that make him incredibly hypocritical because he says he believes in the material. But if we believe him, he has nothing to do with the material. There he is, tape on excellence. Well, what about his website crashing half the time? What about this? Well, there's so many areas of credit. What about taking 10 years later than the rest of the industry to move from cassettes to CDs? What about coming up with excuses to not digitize things and then doing it just late? That's not excellent. But he's got Lazaris publishing this stuff on excellent. Well, there's tons of shitty companies all around America. There's tons of slow pokes. The government is, one of the worst, not catching up to latest science, this and that and the other. So, but Lazaris says that it's easier to succeed than it is to fail. Well, Jach Pursel's life tells a different story. It's riddled with failure. Failure to keep up, failure to innovate, failure to not leave a wreckage of, bitter and unhappy people in the wake of his employment. Failure to bring them. He hasn't even translated the Lazaris material into Chinese, the biggest demographic on the planet. Failure to find the right business partners and not waste money. Failure to, just an incredible amount of normal failure, but juxtaposed against publishing the material. This is easier to succeed than it is to fail. Again, martyrhood. Burdens too heavy to bear. I mean, oh my gosh, people want me to live up to this. Jach can't just retire. Usually business owners get burned out after 20 years of business. It just gets boring. After 20 years of my business, I went into partial retirement. Because it's just tiring to do the same thing over and over again. But Jach's in a monopoly position. If he just stops doing it, why won't Lazaris channel with 5 people? Give Jach some leeway. So Jach could take a 10-year sabbatical and come back refreshed. No. Lazaris says we're a we, but we're only going to channel in you. Why? Jach's got to deal with that. It's his company is as filled with hypocrisy and domination as any other company, and more so because he's been given this monopoly. Now, everyone knows that statistically speaking, it's why you can count on your government being more outdated, more idiotic, more wasteful than just about any entity in your community. Your government is full of shit. Not because they're innately bad people, but because when you've got a monopoly, one, of relatively poorly paid people that don't get rewarded on accomplishment, and you get punished for doing anything wrong and you don't get anything more for doing anything right, it is a recipe for mediocrity. Well, Lazaris gave Jach a monopoly. And people put up with crappy service, with crappy timelines, because it's a monopoly. Because if they believe Lazaris, then it's really important to get the material. Because Lazaris is very self-referential, meaning Lazaris says that they're the biggest resonance, the highest resonance to ever touch the planet, and the whole world is ultimately created with resonance. In other words, Lazaris is saying we're the top of the top, and we're not just the top of the top now. We're not just beyond gods and goddesses and gurus. We're way beyond that. We're not just that now. For the history of humanity, there'll never be another time like us. And this is the most important decade in the history of humanity. Now, you could push that back and say, bullshit. Lazaris, if you talk about you create your own reality, you're saying my future self will not do better than having to sit in lecture-style workshops? What about dialogues? What about pluralism? What about more people being able to, have, virtual channeling experience? You're saying that in 10,000 years, my future self isn't going to be able to create something 10 times better than this experience? And who are you to say that this moment in time, how do you break time up? Because if that time led to this time and this time leads to this time, how do you come up with a period of time that's more important or less important than another period of time? You can say it's a rapidly changing time, but more important, the slow changing times lead to the rapid changing times. You cut out 1,000 years of the past, you don't get the present. You cut off the root of the tree, you don't get the flower. So how can you say the flower is more important than the tree? Well, anyway, Lazaris has said that. If Lazaris says that, one, it puts a huge burden of projection and stuff on Jach, because it makes Jach the most important person on the planet. It's perfect logic. Lazaris is the most important being in the history of humanity, past, present, and future. At the most important time in humanity, past, present, and future. And Jach has a monopoly position on that information. What does that make Jach? The most important conduit in history. Now, can you distinguish the conduit, the channel, from the channel entity? I mean, does it matter if Lazaris is that important if Jach isn't there to channel it? So it puts this weight on Jach. But there's no training manual that comes to Jach to how to handle that power, how not to abuse in this way, how to escape projections. There's no training manual. It's a complete, utter setup for failure, which Jach has played out magnificently. So, Lazaris talking about the elegance of abundance. Jach can't even pay his staff a retirement fund. Jach's closest, former wife, closest friend, etc., they both die in medical and suicide. This is horrendous for Jach. And then Jach's forced to defend this stuff. It's like, I'm selling it. Lazaris says, I created it. Oh, give me a fucking break. And Jach can't just let off on this, partly because he's an emotionally regressed male raised in an emotionally regressed culture. So he doesn't get training manuals on, he was studying to be an insurance executive. He would have been great at that. But that doesn't mean he's a great channel. Nor does it mean it's his fault. Meaning, I have zero confidence that I would have been a better channel, or that any of my friends would somehow have just magically escaped all these hurdles. No. These things, they're just part of doing something very unusual without a lot of maps, without a lot of clarity. Now, one of the reasons for this project is future people, if they want to, can study Jach's mistakes. Well, they'll have less of a burden, around that. And Jach can study his earlier mistakes if he has a good framework for doing so. But let's not pretend that there's anyone that I know that I think, wow, if I had been given this monopoly, I would have learned what I learned. The good business practices that I've learned come from a competitive framework, where if I don't treat my staff better than other people, the staff go over there. Well, I don't want to keep training and wasting. So from purely sociopathic motives, in a competitive framework, you treat your clients better and you treat your staff better. Well, Jach doesn't have that pressure. The most important person in the history of humanity has just given that. So, it's easy to see on the outside, but I have no idea how lonely it must feel to have your two housemates die within 24 hours in this incredible negation of the material you've spent your life publishing, by this entity that talks about, it's mind-boggling. And so, I'm highly critical of the domination, the abuse, the mediocrity, etc. In part because it's painful. In part because Lazaris is not only shaming Jach, but shaming everyone else. And Jach covers it up as part of, the problem, but that's lonely. You cover stuff up, you pretend like we have this wonderful management team, we're not firing people and putting gag orders and afraid of their secrets coming out. No, we're having this one. Jach's living a lie. That's lonely. That's painful. Why is Jach being put in this situation? Well, inadequate training. So, Concept Synergy doesn't train its staff well or select people for competence. The Concept Synergy has selected people for loyalty and submission, not competence. The Concept Synergy didn't say we're going to have a world-class team that's going to innovate and create excellent customer service. We're going to use the best benchmarks. We're going to hire the best people in the world, and we're going to create abundance with ease for all. No. Let's ask you for a pay cut. Let's, you're hanging around. Let's, bring you in, etc. You've got nothing to do. You can work for us for a low wage. We're not going to train you competently because we don't know how to do it. And then as you bumble around, we're going to resent you and punish you and shame you for not knowing what we haven't taught you to do. This is incredibly incompetent, but it is predictable. It is probable. If suddenly you're channeling this material and have to decide on your own what to do with it. Who do you deal with? I'm scared. I don't want to look like an idiot. Well, who won't make me look like an idiot? Well, the people who already believe this stuff. Well, let's hire them. So, but this is not, no one's breaking this down. I've never heard Lazaris talk about how to run a company well. So Jach has to figure that out on his own. So it's not I have empathy on all sides. I have empathy on, me, the teenage self, trying to figure out how I was creating the abuse in my family while my parents were getting divorced. Statistically guaranteed to create shame, confusion, etc. I have empathy for the staff who think that being close to the best, residents of the world will lead to good things happening, only to discover they're dumped in old age without retirement, and controlled and dominated just like any other, abusive company might do that, and call that spiritual family. It's horrible, but let's be honest and compassionate to the fact that Jach's just a guy who doesn't know what the fuck he's doing. And there's no manual for this. And there's plenty of people who've done worse. You can look at Keith Raniere and Nixium. You can look at Scientology. You can look at any number of these kind of cult-like self-referential loops, or the religions. They all talk about they're number one. That's part of chauvinism. We're better than everyone else. We're the top. No, we're the top. So they're all having the same, shtick about being number one. It is a destructive thing as opposed to a shared sense we're one of many. Use this to work, we're one of many. This isn't be present with your life just like any other life. Learn these skills, learn from many people, learn from experts, and be honest with the fact that, this is not going to be a dream in the way that any one of us would think of, wow, would be a dream. Peace on earth, healing medical things, stopping war. It's incredibly shaming to say that your beliefs are creating all of that. And so now Jach's in this position, right? So because he didn't know what he was doing then and couldn't ask for help and, didn't know how much, and, it's an instinct in a sociopathic culture to keep secrets. Because in a sociopathic culture, the more people know about you, the more they attack you. In an empathic culture, the more people know about your problems, the more they help you. But you've got to treat people well to have that, thing. Being told, I'm not going to read your email, doesn't treat me well at a sensitive moment. Barbara Brannan's emails going unanswered as she's getting close to living on the street, as she's, dealing with all the insanity that comes from calling this spiritual family, as she's dealing with PTSD from watching her employer die of medical complications, and then her employee's husband commit suicide, and then having it covered up and then they're all wrapped up under gag orders. That's a recipe for trauma and abuse. So you don't get, the more you traumatize a group of people, the more self-centered they are. So, the amount of trauma, confusion, shame, etc. that I've experienced doesn't leave me saying, okay, we're going to give Jach a pass on all this. Particularly when I see the staff, being hurt even more. But it also does not in any way lead me to believe that somehow Jach's lucky or, we wish we could all live like Jach. This is a hell of a bunch of unfamiliar problems to be, deposited on one's, in one's life with vastly inadequate training. In a cult predisposed to pain. And Jach has and is living that out. And the adult in me can have compassion and no illusions that anyone I know could be doing a much better job. Because a lot of New Agey people are profoundly hypocritical and more crazy than the rest, as their ideas kind of schizophrenically don't interact and intersect with the rest of the cult. So little empathy for Jach.